In the harsh wilderness of 1870s Arizona territory, where the desert wind carries both whispered prayers and dying screams, a legend was born from the most unlikely of meetings. They say love knows no boundaries, but what happens when those boundaries are drawn in blood, carved by generations of hate, and guarded by the ghosts of countless fallen warriors? This is not a tale of heroes and villains, for in the unforgiving Southwest, such simple distinctions crumble like ancient Pueblo walls under the relentless sun. This is the story of Ayana, whose Apache name meant eternal blossom, and whose nightly visits to a forbidden place would challenge everything her people believed about survival, honor, and the price of forbidden love. Every evening, as the sun painted the mountains crimson and the coyotes began their haunting songs, she would come. Through hidden canyon paths known only to her grandmother's grandmother, past sacred burial grounds where warrior spirits still walked, she traveled to a place where two worlds met in secret. For months, this dangerous ritual continued, until one fateful day when a simple act of mercy would ignite a chain of events that would forever change the destiny of two peoples locked in an endless cycle of war. What you are about to discover is more than just a love story. It is a testament to the power of human connection in the face of impossible odds, a chronicle of choices that echo through generations, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest courage is found not in battle, but in the quiet moments when we choose to see our supposed enemies as fellow human beings. The desert remembers everything. And this is one story it will never let the wind carry away. The ancient Apache saying echoed in Ayana's mind as she prepared for another dangerous journey: the heart that seeks forbidden paths must be prepared to walk them alone. Yet as the sun began its descent behind the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, she found herself drawn once again to the hidden trail that wound through Devil's Canyon, a route that would lead her far from the safety of her people's camp and into territory where discovery could mean death. At 19, Ayana possessed the fluid grace of a desert cat and the sharp intelligence that had made her grandmother, Winona, the most respected medicine woman among their band of Chiricahua Apache. Her long black hair, traditionally braided with strips of soft deerskin and adorned with small silver ornaments traded from Mexican merchants, caught the last golden rays of sunlight as she gathered her worn leather pouch and checked the contents carefully. Inside were precious items: a bundle of healing herbs, strips of dried venison, a small ceramic water vessel, and, most importantly, a rolled piece of doeskin that contained detailed drawings of medicinal plants and their uses. For 3 months now, ever since the scorching heat of late summer had given way to the more bearable warmth of early autumn, Ayana had been making this treacherous journey every evening. The path she followed was known only to a few members of her tribe, a secret route discovered generations ago by Apache warriors who used it to move unseen through enemy territory. It began innocently enough, winding through the familiar red rock formations near her people's temporary camp, past the sacred spring where Apache mothers brought their newborns for blessing, and through the grove of ancient cottonwood trees where the elders gathered to share stories of the old days when their people roamed freely across the vast southwestern landscape. But, as the trail descended deeper into Devil's Canyon, it became something else entirely: a narrow ribbon of packed earth that hugged the canyon wall and required sure footing and unwavering concentration. One misstep could send a traveler tumbling into the rocky depths below, where bleached bones of both animals and men served as silent testimony to the canyon's deadly nature. The Apache had given this place its ominous name not because of any supernatural presence, but because of the many lives it had claimed over the years, both from their own people and from the various enemies who had attempted to use it as a route of attack. As she began her descent into the canyon's shadowy depths, Ayana's thoughts turned to the strange circumstances that had led her to begin these nightly pilgrimages. It had started with a hunting accident, or what her people had assumed was a hunting accident when they found her unconscious near the canyon's edge 3 months ago. She had been gathering medicinal plants for her grandmother, searching for a particular type of sage that grew only in the rocky crevices of the canyon walls, when she had heard something that changed the course of her life forever. The sound had been unmistakably human, a low moan of pain carried on the desert wind. Her first instinct had been to flee, for anything human in this desolate place could only mean danger. The canyon served as an unofficial boundary between Apache territory and the lands claimed by white settlers, though such boundaries meant little to either side when survival was at stake. But, as she had crouched behind a boulder, preparing to make her way back to safety, the sound had come again, weaker this time, filled with a desperation that spoke to something deep within her spirit. Curiosity and compassion had overridden caution, leading her to investigate the source of the distress. What she had found, lying partially concealed behind a fallen tree trunk, had challenged everything she thought she knew about the white men her people considered their enemies. The man was young, perhaps only a few years older than herself, with sun-weathered skin and hair the color of dried autumn grass. He wore the typical clothing of a ranch hand, worn denim trousers, a faded blue shirt, and leather boots that had seen countless miles of hard travel. But it was his condition that had captured her attention and, ultimately, her concern. A crude bandage fashioned from a torn shirt sleeve was wrapped around his left leg, dark with dried blood that indicated a serious wound. His lips were cracked and pale from dehydration, and his breathing was shallow and labored. Most telling of all were his hands, which bore the calluses of hard honest work rather than the softer skin she associated with soldiers or the wealthy ranchers who seemed to consider Apache people as nothing more than obstacles to be removed. The sensible thing would have been to leave him there, to let the desert claim another enemy of her people. This man represented everything that threatened the Apache way of life, the encroaching tide of white settlement that had already claimed so much of their ancestral lands. Her own father had died fighting men who looked exactly like this stranger, falling in a skirmish near the Gila River when she was only 14. Her brother had been wounded by cavalry soldiers the previous spring, bearing scars that would remind him forever of the ongoing conflict between their peoples. But, as Ayanna had knelt beside the unconscious man, studying his face in the fading light of that first evening, she had seen something that gave her pause. There was no cruelty in his features, no hint of the hardness she had observed in the faces of soldiers who had attacked her people's camps. Instead, she saw someone who looked as though he belonged to the land itself, someone whose weathered appearance spoke of a deep connection to the harsh beauty of the southwestern wilderness. The decision to help him had not been made lightly. For nearly an hour, she had remained crouched beside his still form, weighing the potential consequences of her actions. To aid an enemy of her people could be seen as betrayal of the worst kind, punishable by exile or even death depending upon the judgment of the tribal council. But, to leave him to die would violate the most fundamental principles of Apache spirituality, which taught that all life was sacred and that those with the knowledge and ability to heal had a responsibility to use their gifts when faced with genuine need. In the end, it was the memory of her grandmother's teachings that had guided her decision. Winona had always told her that the spirits often tested the hearts of healers by placing difficult choices before them, and that true wisdom lay in listening to the voice of compassion even when doing so required great personal risk. The elderly medicine woman frequently reminded her granddaughter that healing was not simply about treating wounds and brewing herbal remedies, but about recognizing the fundamental humanity that connected all living beings. Working quickly before darkness could make her task impossible, Ayanna had used her knowledge of desert survival to begin treating the stranger's injuries. She had carefully examined his wounded leg, determining that the injury appeared to be from a fall rather than a gunshot, though the gash was deep enough to require immediate attention. Using water from her own supply and strips of cloth torn from her spare clothing, she had cleaned the wound as thoroughly as possible before applying a poultice made from herbs she carried in her medicine bundle. The man had regained consciousness briefly during her ministrations, his eyes opening to reveal irises the color of sage after rain. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, their gazes had met and held, and Ayanna had seen recognition there, not of her specifically but of what she was doing for him. There had been no fear in his expression, no anger or hostility, only a deep gratitude that transcended the barriers of language and culture. He had tried to speak, but she had placed a gentle finger against his lips, understanding instinctively that conversation was not only impossible but dangerous for both of them. Instead, she had simply continued her work, using gestures and expressions to communicate her intentions. When she had finished treating his wound and given him small sips of water from her vessel, she had gathered several edible plants and placed them within his reach, along with a small amount of her own food. Through a combination of pointing and simple hand gestures, she had managed to convey that he needed to stay hidden until his strength returned, and that she would return the following evening to check on his progress. That first night, as she had made her way back through the treacherous canyon path under the light of a crescent moon, Ayanna had expected never to see the strange white man again. She had assumed that he would either recover enough to leave the area or that the desert would claim him despite her efforts. Either way, she had believed their brief encounter would remain nothing more than an unusual memory, a single act of compassion that would fade into the countless other experiences that made up the complex tapestry of life in Apache territory. But, when she had returned the following evening, driven by a combination of medical responsibility and simple human concern, she had found him still there, alert and, obviously much stronger than he had been the night before. The wound on his leg, while still serious, showed clear signs of healing, and the color had returned to his face. Most surprisingly, he had apparently spent the day gathering firewood and edible plants, activities that suggested both practical knowledge of desert survival and a basic understanding that he needed to contribute to his own recovery rather than simply depend upon her help. Their second meeting had established a pattern that had continued for weeks. Each evening, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Ayanna would make her careful way down the canyon trail to the small sheltered alcove where the stranger had made his temporary camp. She would bring fresh water, food when she could spare it, and medicinal herbs to continue treating his wound and building up his strength. In return, he had begun contributing what he could to their strange partnership, gathering fuel for small cooking fires, locating edible plants and roots, and even managing to catch small game using traps constructed from materials at hand. Communication between them had evolved gradually from simple gestures to a basic understanding that transcended language barriers. Though they shared no common tongue, Ayanna had discovered that human connection could be established through expressions, actions, and the universal languages of kindness and gratitude. She had learned that his name was something that sounded like Marcus when he pronounced it, and she had taught him to say Ayanna in return, laughing quietly at his initial attempts to master the unfamiliar sounds. More importantly, she had come to understand that her initial impression of him as someone who belonged to the land had been accurate. Marcus clearly possessed extensive knowledge of desert survival, understanding which plants were safe to eat, how to find water in seemingly barren terrain, and how to move through the landscape without leaving obvious signs of his passage. This was not the knowledge of a casual visitor to the southwest, but the accumulated wisdom of someone who had spent years learning to live in harmony with the harsh beauty of the region. As the weeks had passed and Marcus had grown stronger, their evening meetings had taken on an almost ritualistic quality. Ayanna would arrive just as the last light was fading from the western sky, moving with practiced silence through the shadows of the canyon. She would find him waiting, always alert and watchful, but with a warmth in his expression that spoke of genuine appreciation for her continued care. Together, they would share whatever food she had brought, communicating through gestures and simple sounds about their respective days and any concerns about his recovery. During these quiet interludes, sitting beside a small fire that Marcus had learned to build in such a way that its light would not be visible beyond their hidden alcove, Ayanna had begun to see past the surface differences that supposedly made them natural enemies. She had observed his gentle handling of injured birds he occasionally found, his careful attention to leaving no unnecessary trace of his presence in the canyon, and his obvious respect for the natural world around him. These were not the behaviors she had been taught to expect from white men, who were generally portrayed by her people as wasteful and destructive in their relationship with the land. Even more surprisingly, she had begun to recognize in Marcus a loneliness that matched her own. Despite being surrounded by her people and beloved by her grandmother, Ayanna had always felt somewhat apart from the others in her band. Her intense interest in healing and her tendency toward quiet contemplation set her apart from young women her age who were more focused on traditional pursuits of courtship and household management. Her unusual intelligence and strong opinions, while valued by the tribal elders, sometimes created distance between herself and potential suitors who preferred more conventional feminine behavior. In Marcus, she had found someone who seemed to understand and appreciate her unique qualities without expecting her to change or conform to predetermined expectations. Though they could communicate only through the most basic means, she sensed in him a kindred spirit, someone who had also chosen a path that set him apart from his own people. The careful way he had adapted to survival in the canyon, his obvious comfort with solitude, and his respectful treatment of her suggested a man who had learned to find meaning in simple human connection rather than in the approval of larger society. Now, 3 months after that first fateful encounter, Ayanna found herself anticipating these evening meetings with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened her. What had begun as simple medical responsibility had evolved into something far more complex and potentially dangerous. She had begun to care deeply about Marcus's welfare, not just as a healer tending to a patient, but as a woman drawn to a man whose character and spirit spoke to something fundamental within her own nature. As she navigated the final treacherous descent to their meeting place on this particular evening, Ayanna reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since beginning these secret journeys. The grandmother who had taught her everything about healing would be horrified to learn that she was regularly meeting with a white man, regardless of the circumstances. The tribal council would likely view her actions as betrayal deserving of severe punishment. Even her closest friends among the other young women would struggle to understand how she could risk so much for someone who represented everything their people opposed. But, as she caught sight of the familiar glow of a carefully concealed fire and saw Marcus's silhouette moving within their hidden sanctuary, Ayanna knew that she had moved far beyond the point where such considerations could influence her behavior. Whatever the consequences might be, she was no longer able to imagine her life without these precious hours of connection and understanding. The forbidden nature of their relationship only seemed to intensify the bond that had formed between them, creating a sense of intimacy and shared secret that made the outside world seem distant and irrelevant. Tonight, however, something felt different. As she approached their usual meeting place, Ayanna noticed that Marcus seemed more restless than usual, pacing within the confines of their small camp rather than simply waiting for her arrival. His wounded leg had healed completely weeks ago, leaving him fully mobile and capable of traveling wherever he chose to go. Yet he had remained in the canyon, apparently as reluctant as she was to bring their unusual relationship to an end. When she stepped into the circle of firelight, Marcus turned toward her with an expression she had never seen before, a mixture of excitement and uncertainty that immediately put her on edge. For the first time since their initial meeting, she sensed that change was coming, that the comfortable pattern they had established was about to be disrupted by forces beyond their control. The very air around them seemed charged with anticipation, as though the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next in this unlikely love story that had bloomed in the most forbidden of places. Marcus had spent the entire day preparing for this moment, knowing that what he was about to reveal would either deepen the extraordinary bond he shared with Ayanna or shatter it completely. For weeks, he had carried the weight of his deception, watching her risk everything to care for him while believing him to be something he was not. The truth burned within him like a fever, demanding release even as his rational mind warned of the potentially catastrophic consequences of honesty. As Ayanna settled beside the fire with her usual graceful economy of movement, Marcus studied her face in the dancing light of the flames. 3 months of evening meetings had allowed him to memorize every detail of her features, from the strong line of her jaw that spoke of determination and courage, to the gentle curve of her lips that could convey more emotion without words than most people managed with elaborate speeches. Her dark eyes, bright with intelligence and compassion, had become the beacon that guided him through each day in the canyon, the promise that evening would bring another precious opportunity for connection. Tonight, those same eyes reflected curiosity about his obvious agitation, and Marcus realized that he could no longer postpone the conversation he had been rehearsing in his mind for days. During their time together, they had developed an intricate system of communication that combined basic words in both English and Apache with elaborate gestures and drawings in the sand. While their conversations remained necessarily simple, they had managed to share stories about their childhoods, their dreams, and their observations about the natural world around them. What they had never discussed, what Marcus had carefully avoided revealing, was the truth about who he was and why he had been in Devil's Canyon on that fateful day when Ayanna had found him injured and alone. He had allowed her to believe that he was simply another ranch hand, one of the countless young men who drifted across the Southwest in search of work and adventure. The assumption had been natural enough, given his practical clothing and his obvious familiarity with outdoor survival, and he had done nothing to correct her misunderstanding. The reality was far more complicated and potentially devastating to any hope of continuing their relationship. Marcus James Thornfield was not a drifting cowboy seeking temporary employment. He was the youngest son of Colonel Harrison Thornfield, the military commander responsible for implementing the government's policy of Apache removal in the Arizona Territory. More specifically, he was the son of the man who had ordered the attack on Ayanna's village 2 years ago, the raid that had resulted in the death of her father and several other members of her band. The irony of the situation was almost unbearable. While his father spent his days planning strategies to drive the Apache people from their ancestral lands, Marcus had been living in secret harmony with one of the most remarkable individuals he had ever encountered, regardless of race or culture. While Colonel Thornfield wrote reports to Washington describing Apache people as savage obstacles to civilization, his son had discovered in Ayanna a depth of wisdom, compassion, and intelligence that put to shame most of the educated society ladies he had known in his former life. Marcus had not come to the canyon as part of any military mission. Instead, he had been fleeing from everything his family name represented, running from a future that had been planned for him since childhood but which he found increasingly impossible to accept. The wound that had left him helpless when Ayanna found him had been sustained during his desperate attempt to escape from Fort Bowie, where his father had arranged for him to receive a commission as a junior officer in the cavalry. The irony ran even deeper than Ayanna could possibly know. Not only was Marcus the son of her people's greatest enemy, but he had been scheduled to participate directly in the ongoing campaign against the Apache. His father had intended for him to gain practical experience in Indian fighting, believing that exposure to what the colonel considered the brutal realities of frontier warfare would cure his son of the impractical humanitarian sentiments he had acquired during his education in the East. Growing up as the son of a career military officer, Marcus had spent his childhood moving from one frontier post to another, witnessing firsthand the devastating impact of the Indian Wars on both sides of the conflict. Unlike his father and older brothers, who had embraced the military life with enthusiasm, Marcus had been troubled by what he observed. He had seen the pain in the eyes of Apache children rounded up during raids, had witnessed the grief of parents separated from their families, and had begun to question the morality of a system that treated an entire people as enemies to be eliminated or controlled. His doubts had crystallized during his years at a prestigious Eastern college, where exposure to different perspectives and philosophical ideas had strengthened his conviction that the government's Indian policies were fundamentally unjust. When he had attempted to share these views with his family, the result had been a bitter conflict that had reached a crescendo during his most recent visit home. His father had made it clear that Marcus would either accept his commission and prove his loyalty to family and country, or be disowned entirely. The night before he was scheduled to report for duty, Marcus had made the desperate decision to disappear entirely. He had slipped away from Fort Bowie under cover of darkness, taking only basic supplies and hoping to reach Mexico, where he believed he might be able to start a new life free from the expectations and prejudices of his birth. The injury that had left him stranded in Devil's Canyon had occurred during a fall from his horse as he navigated the treacherous terrain in darkness, an accident that had seemed like a disaster at the time but which now appeared to have been the hand of fate guiding him toward the most meaningful relationship of his life. Now, as he sat across from Ayanna in their hidden sanctuary, Marcus struggled to find the words that would convey not only the facts of his identity but also the profound transformation he had undergone during their months together. How could he explain that loving her had taught him more about honor, courage, and genuine humanity than all his years of formal education and military training combined? How could he make her understand that she had become not just the center of his universe, but the inspiration for a completely new understanding of what his life might become? Drawing a deep breath, Marcus began to sketch in the sand between them, using the visual communication method they had developed to supplement their limited shared vocabulary. First, he drew a simple representation of a military fort, complete with walls and guard towers. Then, using gestures and the few Apache words he had learned, he attempted to convey that this place was connected to his own history. Ayanna watched with growing puzzlement as he continued his sandy narrative, adding figures in military uniforms and attempting to indicate through pointing and facial expressions that these soldiers were somehow related to him. When understanding finally dawned in her eyes, the change in her expression was immediate and devastating. The warmth and trust that had characterized their relationship vanished, replaced by a hardness that made Marcus's heart contract with fear. The Apache word she spoke was unfamiliar to him, but her tone made its meaning unmistakable. She was asking for confirmation of what she had begun to suspect, demanding to know if he was indeed connected to the military forces that had brought so much suffering to her people. Marcus nodded slowly, hating himself for the pain he could see spreading across her beautiful features, but knowing that any attempt to lie or minimize the truth would only make the situation worse. What followed was the longest and most difficult conversation of their entire relationship. Using every resource of their improvised communication system, Marcus struggled to explain not just who he was, but who he had chosen to become. He drew pictures showing his rejection of military life, his flight from Fort Bowie, and his determination never to participate in actions against the Apache people. He tried to convey through words, gestures, and desperate sincerity that meeting her had confirmed and strengthened his conviction that the conflict between their peoples was wrong. Ayanna listened in stony silence, her face a mask that revealed nothing of her thoughts or emotions. When Marcus had exhausted his ability to explain and justify his presence in her life, she rose abruptly and disappeared into the darkness beyond their campfire. For several terrifying minutes, he believed that she had left forever, that the revelation of his identity had destroyed any possibility of continuing their relationship. When she returned, however, it was with an armload of deadwood for the fire and an expression that suggested internal struggle rather than simple rejection. Settling herself across from him once again, she began her own halting explanation, combining Apache words with English ones she had picked up from their time together and illustrating her narrative with her own drawings in the sand. What she told him struck Marcus like a physical blow. Through painful increments, she revealed that her father had been killed during a military raid 2 years earlier, and that the commanding officer responsible for that attack had been a Colonel Thornfield. The realization that his own father was directly responsible for the death of her beloved parent created a chasm of guilt and horror that seemed impossible to bridge. Yet even as Marcus grappled with this devastating knowledge, Ayanna continued her story, explaining through tears and trembling words how caring for him had taught her that individual human beings could not be judged solely by the actions of their relatives or the groups to which they belonged. She described her own internal struggle between loyalty to her people's justified anger and her growing understanding that Marcus himself was not responsible for the sins of his father. The conversation that night lasted until dawn, two young people from warring cultures struggling to find common ground across an abyss of historical hatred and personal grief. They explored questions that had no easy answers. Could love transcend the barriers erected by violence and prejudice? Was it possible to honor the memory of the dead while choosing forgiveness over vengeance? Could two individuals create something beautiful and meaningful despite the ugly realities of the world around them? By the time the sun began to rise over the canyon walls, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, they had not resolved all of these complex issues. But they had reached a tentative understanding that their feelings for each other were genuine and valuable, regardless of the external forces that sought to make such feelings impossible. They had agreed that they would continue to meet, but with a new awareness of the risks they faced and the difficult choices that lay ahead. More importantly, they had begun to envision a future that transcended the limitations of their current circumstances. Marcus had revealed his dream of traveling to California, where the discovery of gold had created communities where people of different backgrounds sometimes found ways to live together peacefully. Ayanna had shared her own longing to use her healing knowledge to help people regardless of their race or tribe, following the example of her grandmother's teachings about the universal nature of compassion. Together, they had begun to imagine a life where they might combine their different knowledge and skills in service of something larger than themselves. Marcus possessed formal education and familiarity with white society that could prove valuable in navigating the complex world beyond Apache territory. Ayanna brought wisdom about traditional healing, deep knowledge of the natural world, and, most importantly, a perspective on life that had already transformed Marcus's understanding of what truly mattered. But, even as they dared to dream about a shared future, both understood that reaching such a destination would require them to overcome obstacles that might prove insurmountable. Marcus would need to find a way to completely separate himself from his family's legacy, creating a new identity that would allow him to live according to his own values rather than those imposed by his birth. Ayanna would face the even more difficult challenge of leaving behind everything she had ever known, abandoning her people at a time when they needed every member to survive the ongoing pressure of white expansion. The decision they reached as the morning light grew stronger was to continue their evening meetings while each worked to resolve the practical problems that stood between them and any hope of a life together. Marcus would use his knowledge of the white world to investigate possibilities for disappearing completely, perhaps by assuming a new identity and traveling to a place where his family's influence could not reach. Ayanna would gradually prepare her grandmother for the possibility that she might choose a path that would take her away from Apache territory, though without revealing the specific nature of her plans. As they parted that morning, both understood that they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no retreat. The comfortable pattern of their relationship had been shattered by truth, but, from the fragments, they were attempting to build something stronger and more honest. Whether their love would prove strong enough to overcome the forces arrayed against it remained to be seen, but they were no longer content to exist in the liminal space of stolen hours and secret meetings. The revelation had changed everything, and there was no going back to the innocent days when their greatest concern had been avoiding discovery by passing travelers. Now they faced choices that would determine not only their own fates, but potentially the fates of their families and communities as well. The stakes had been raised beyond anything either had imagined possible, and the next phase of their relationship would test every aspect of their characters, their commitment, and their courage. The autumn moon hung like a silver medallion against the star-scattered sky as Ayana made her way through the familiar canyon paths, her heart heavy with the knowledge that tonight might be her last journey to the hidden alcove where she had found both love and heartbreak. For 2 weeks following Marcus's devastating revelation about his true identity, they had continued their evening meetings with a desperate intensity, both knowing that their time together was running out like water through cupped fingers. The weight of their impossible situation had grown heavier with each passing day. Marcus had begun making concrete plans for his disappearance, using his knowledge of military procedures and his father's correspondence to identify potential escape routes that would take him far from Arizona territory. Meanwhile, Ayana had been struggling with increasingly difficult questions from her grandmother, whose sharp eyes had noticed the subtle changes in her granddaughter's behavior and the mysterious absences that coincided with her evening herb-gathering expeditions. Winona had not directly confronted Ayana about her suspicions, but the elderly medicine woman's probing questions had become more frequent and more pointed. The previous morning, she had asked specifically about the canyon plants that Ayana claimed to be collecting, requesting to examine the herbs her granddaughter had supposedly gathered during recent expeditions. When Ayana had been unable to produce sufficient quantities of the plants she claimed to have been seeking, Winona's expression had made it clear that she knew her granddaughter was engaging in some form of deception. Even more troubling had been the conversation Ayana had overheard between her grandmother and the tribal council's war leader, a fierce warrior named Cochita who had been advocating for more aggressive action against white settlements in response to recent cavalry patrols near Apache camps. Cochita had mentioned unusual tracks near Devil's Canyon, signs that suggested someone had been using the secret trail on a regular basis. While he had not yet connected these disturbances to Ayana's activities, she knew it was only a matter of time before the truth would be discovered. The pressure was building from Marcus's side as well. His prolonged absence from Fort Bowie had not gone unnoticed, and his father had dispatched search parties to locate his missing son. While these efforts had so far been unsuccessful, Marcus had reported seeing distant dust clouds that suggested increased military activity in the surrounding area. Colonel Thornfield's determination to recover his wayward son was apparently matched only by his fury at what he viewed as desertion in the face of duty. Adding to their difficulties was the approach of winter, which would make survival in the canyon impossible even for someone with Marcus's considerable outdoor skills. The altitude and exposure of their meeting place meant that temperatures would soon drop to levels that could be fatal for anyone attempting to camp in the area without substantial shelter and supplies. Time was running out on multiple fronts, forcing both of them to confront the reality that they would soon have to choose between abandoning their relationship or taking drastic action that would forever change their lives. It was against this backdrop of mounting pressure and looming deadlines that Ayana approached their meeting place on what she had secretly decided might be their final evening together. She had spent the day making her own preparations for a permanent separation, gathering supplies that Marcus would need for his journey and composing a mental farewell that would somehow convey the depth of her feelings while acknowledging the impossibility of their situation. But, as she rounded the final bend in the canyon trail, Ayana immediately sensed that something was wrong. The usual glow of Marcus's carefully concealed fire was absent, replaced by a darkness that sent chills of apprehension down her spine. Her first thought was that he had already departed, choosing to avoid a painful goodbye by simply disappearing into the night. The possibility filled her with a grief so profound that she had to stop walking and steady herself against the canyon wall. When she finally reached their usual meeting place, however, she discovered that the reality was far worse than simple abandonment. Marcus was there, but he was not alone. 3 figures sat around a small fire, their faces illuminated by flames that revealed the distinctive uniforms of cavalry soldiers. Marcus himself sat with his hands bound behind his back, his face bearing evidence of a recent struggle, while 2 armed men kept careful watch over their prisoner. The third man, clearly the leader of the group based on his bearing and the deference shown by the others, was older and bore a striking resemblance to Marcus despite the hardness that had replaced any trace of his son's gentleness. Even without formal introductions, Ayana knew she was looking at Colonel Harrison Thornfield, the man responsible for her father's death and the architect of so much suffering for her people. From her position in the shadows beyond the firelight, Ayana could hear fragments of the conversation taking place around the flames. Colonel Thornfield's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience as he berated his son for what he termed disgraceful behavior unbecoming of an officer and a gentleman. Marcus responded with quiet defiance, refusing to express regret for his actions and maintaining that he would never willingly participate in the campaign against the Apache people. The colonel's anger was evident as he outlined the consequences of Marcus's desertion, explaining that court-martial proceedings had already begun and that only his intervention had prevented his son from being classified as a fugitive. He demanded to know what had driven Marcus to such desperate measures, what influence had corrupted his thinking so completely that he would choose disgrace over duty to his country and his family. When Marcus remained silent, refusing to provide the explanations his father demanded, Colonel Thornfield's voice took on a more threatening tone. He spoke of interrogation techniques that would be employed if necessary, methods of extracting information that would leave no room for continued defiance. The implications were clear: one way or another, they would discover what had led to Marcus's rebellion against everything his family represented. From her hiding place, Ayanna watched in growing horror as the situation deteriorated. She understood enough English to grasp the basic nature of the conversation, and she could see that Marcus was trying to protect her by refusing to reveal any details about their relationship. His loyalty to her was touching, but it was also potentially futile, since his father's determination seemed absolute and his resources for uncovering the truth were considerable. The immediate question facing Ayanna was whether she should attempt to intervene or retreat to safety while she still could. Every instinct of self-preservation urged her to slip away into the darkness, to return to her people's camp and pretend that this encounter had never taken place. Discovery by Colonel Thornfield would mean certain death, not just for herself but potentially for Marcus as well, since their relationship would be seen as evidence of treason deserving the ultimate punishment. But, as she watched Marcus endure his father's increasingly harsh interrogation, Ayanna found herself unable to simply abandon the man who had shown her such profound love and respect. Their relationship had been built on mutual courage in the face of impossible circumstances, and now was not the time to allow fear to override the bonds of affection and loyalty they had forged together. More importantly, Ayanna began to recognize that this moment represented something larger than the personal crisis facing her and Marcus. This confrontation between father and son embodied the broader conflict between two incompatible visions of the future, one based on domination and control, the other founded on understanding and cooperation. If Marcus was captured and forced to return to military service, it would represent not just the end of their love story, but a victory for the forces of hatred and violence over the possibility of peace. As these thoughts raced through her mind, Ayanna noticed something that gave her pause. One of the soldiers guarding Marcus appeared to be little more than a boy, probably no older than 16, and his discomfort with the situation was evident in his frequent glances away from the interrogation. The other guard was older and more experienced, but he too seemed uneasy with Colonel Thornfield's increasingly aggressive questioning of his own son. An idea began to form in Ayanna's mind, a desperate plan that would require perfect timing and considerable luck to succeed. If she could create enough of a distraction to disrupt the soldier's attention, Marcus might be able to escape in the confusion. The canyon offered numerous hiding places that would be familiar to him after months of residence, and his knowledge of the terrain might give him an advantage over pursuers who were unfamiliar with the area. The plan was enormously risky and likely to fail, but Ayanna could see no alternative that offered any hope of preserving Marcus's freedom. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, she began moving carefully through the rocks and shadows surrounding the campsite, working her way into position for what she knew might be her final act of love for the man who had transformed her understanding of what was possible between people of different worlds. As she prepared to put her desperate plan into action, Ayanna reflected on the irony of the situation. She was about to risk everything to save the son of the man who had killed her father, attempting to protect someone whose very existence represented everything her people had learned to fear and hate. Yet she felt no hesitation or conflict about her choice, because she had learned through their months together that individual identity transcended group membership, that personal character mattered more than inherited prejudices. The sound of Colonel Thornfield's voice growing more threatening finally galvanized Ayanna into action. Moving with the silent precision that had been drilled into her through years of traditional training, she positioned herself on the rocky slope above the campsite and began implementing her hastily conceived rescue plan. Whether it would succeed or lead to disaster for both of them remained to be seen, but she was no longer willing to stand by passively while the man she loved faced destruction at the hands of his own father. The next few minutes would determine not only their immediate fate, but whether the love that had bloomed between them in the hidden places of Devil's Canyon would survive to influence a future that suddenly seemed more uncertain than ever. Everything they had built together was about to be tested in the crucible of violence and family loyalty, and the outcome would echo through both their lives for years to come. The silence that followed Ayana's carefully aimed stone striking the young soldier's rifle seemed to stretch for an eternity, a moment suspended between intention and consequence when anything might still be possible. Then, chaos erupted around the small campfire as the startled guards scrambled to identify the source of the attack while Colonel Thornfield barked orders that echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. Ayana had positioned herself among a cluster of boulders that provided both concealment and an elevated view of the campsite below. Her plan, conceived in desperation and refined through frantic moments of observation, depended upon creating enough confusion to allow Marcus an opportunity to break free from his captors. The stone that had struck the young soldier's weapon was merely the opening move in a sequence that would require split-second timing and considerable luck to succeed. As the soldiers drew their weapons and began scanning the rocky slopes for signs of their unseen attacker, Ayana launched the second phase of her improvised rescue attempt. Moving with fluid precision through the shadows, she began creating a cascade of small rock slides designed to suggest multiple attackers approaching from different directions. The technique was one she had learned during childhood games with other Apache children, but tonight it carried deadly serious implications. The deception proved more effective than she had dared hope. Within moments, the two guards were convinced they were facing an assault by several Apache warriors rather than a single young woman armed with nothing more than stones and desperate courage. Their training took over, leading them to establish a defensive perimeter that unfortunately placed them between Marcus and the most obvious escape routes from the campsite. Colonel Thornfield's reaction was swift and decisive. Rather than allowing panic to compromise their position, he immediately began organizing a methodical response to what he perceived as an Apache ambush. His military experience had taught him that such attacks typically preceded larger assaults, and his primary concern became ensuring that his small group could maintain their position until reinforcements arrived. But the colonel's tactical expertise, formidable though it was, could not account for variables he had no reason to suspect. He had no way of knowing that his son's captor was actually his son's beloved, or that the apparent attack was being conducted by someone intimately familiar with both the terrain and Marcus's exact location. Most importantly, he could not anticipate moves being made by someone whose primary objective was rescue rather than destruction. From his position near the fire, hands still bound behind his back, Marcus quickly grasped what was happening and began working to free himself while his captors focused on the external threat. The ropes securing his wrists had been tied by soldiers accustomed to restraining ordinary prisoners rather than someone with his knowledge of outdoor survival techniques. Working with desperate efficiency, he began the painful process of loosening his bonds while maintaining an appearance of helpless compliance. Ayana continued her carefully orchestrated campaign of misdirection, using her knowledge of the canyon's acoustic properties to make sounds that seemed to come from multiple locations simultaneously. The narrow walls and complex rock formations created echoes and distortions that enhanced the illusion of a coordinated attack by several warriors, convincing the increasingly nervous soldiers that they were vastly outnumbered. The young soldier who had been struck by her first stone was particularly affected by the apparent assault, his inexperience making him susceptible to the fear that could prove fatal in combat situations. His nervous movements and obvious anxiety began affecting the morale of his companion, creating exactly the kind of uncertainty that Ayana hoped to exploit. Colonel Thornfield, however, remained calm and focused despite the seeming danger surrounding his small command. His years of frontier warfare had taught him to distinguish between genuine threats and elaborate deceptions, and something about the current situation struck him as unusual. The lack of gunfire, the random nature of the falling stones, and the absence of war cries all suggested something other than a typical Apache attack. When a particularly large rock slide sent both guards scrambling for cover, Marcus seized the moment he had been waiting for. The ropes around his wrists had been worked loose enough to allow him to slip free, and he immediately rolled away from the firelight into the protective darkness beyond the camp's perimeter. His movement was swift and silent, the culmination of months spent learning to navigate the canyon's treacherous terrain without creating sound or disturbance. The discovery of their prisoner's escape triggered an immediate escalation in the soldiers' response. Colonel Thornfield's voice cut through the confusion as he ordered his men to forget the supposed attackers and focus on recapturing his son. Torches were lit and the systematic search began, with the three men spreading out to cover the most likely escape routes from the immediate area. But Marcus possessed advantages that his pursuers could not match. His months of residence in Devil's Canyon had taught him every hidden path, every concealed alcove, every narrow passage that could provide refuge for someone who knew how to move through the landscape like a ghost. More importantly, he understood that Ayanna was somewhere in the darkness around them, and that their survival depended upon their ability to coordinate their movements without direct communication. The next phase of their escape required a level of trust and intuitive understanding that transcended their language barriers and cultural differences. Moving separately through the maze of rocks and shadows, they had to somehow find each other while avoiding three determined pursuers who possessed both military training and superior equipment. The slightest mistake could result in capture, with consequences that neither wanted to contemplate. Ayanna's knowledge of traditional Apache stealth techniques proved invaluable as she worked her way through the canyon terrain toward the rendezvous point she hoped Marcus would remember from their previous conversations. The location was a narrow crevice in the canyon wall that could be reached only by someone familiar with a specific sequence of hand and footholds, a natural hiding place that they had discovered together during one of their evening explorations. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of the search intensifying as Colonel Thornfield's tactical expertise began to assert itself over the initial confusion. The soldiers were methodically working through the most obvious hiding places, their torchlight creating moving pools of illumination that forced her to time her movements with extraordinary precision. Marcus, meanwhile, was making his way toward the same destination through a different route, using skills learned during his college years as a member of mountaineering clubs to navigate cliff faces that would have challenged experienced climbers. The physical demands of his escape route were enormous, but adrenaline and desperation provided strength beyond his normal capabilities. The critical moment came when both fugitives reached the vicinity of their planned meeting place almost simultaneously. The narrow crevice that was their destination lay directly ahead, but reaching it required crossing an open area where torchlight from the searchers below would make concealment impossible. They would have to time their final dash perfectly, moving together with the coordination of dancers performing a routine practiced countless times. In the event, their coordination proved flawless. Moving as though guided by a single mind, they crossed the exposed ground in a silent rush that carried them to safety mere seconds before Colonel Thornfield's torch illuminated the space they had just vacated. The crevice that swallowed them was barely wide enough for one person at a time, but it led to a hidden chamber where they could rest and plan their next moves without fear of immediate discovery. Pressed together in the absolute darkness of their refuge, they communicated through whispered words and gentle touches, sharing their relief at surviving the first phase of their escape while acknowledging that greater challenges lay ahead. The soldiers would eventually discover their hiding place if given enough time, and Colonel Thornfield's determination to recover his son would not be easily discouraged. More troubling was the realization that their relationship could no longer remain secret. Whether they were recaptured tonight or managed to escape completely, the events in Devil's Canyon would have consequences that extended far beyond their personal situation. Marcus's desertion would be viewed as confirmation that he had been corrupted by enemy influence, while Ayanna's involvement would mark her as a traitor to her own people. Their only hope lay in disappearing so completely that neither military authorities nor Apache tribal councils would be able to locate them. This meant abandoning not just their families and communities, but their entire identities, creating new lives in places where their past could not follow them. The prospect was terrifying, but the alternative was separation or death, possibilities that had become unthinkable. As they huddled together in their temporary sanctuary, planning the next phase of an escape that would take them far from everything they had ever known, both understood that they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. Whatever happened in the hours ahead, their old lives had ended that night in Devil's Canyon. Whether they would survive to build something new together remained to be seen, but they were no longer willing to let external forces dictate the boundaries of their love. The sound of Colonel Thornfield's voice calling his son's name echoed through the canyon like the cry of a wounded animal, a father's pain mixing with a soldier's fury to create something that was both heartbreaking and terrifying. The search would continue until dawn, and beyond if necessary, but the two young people hidden in the canyon's deepest secrets had already begun their journey toward a freedom that would test every aspect of their courage, their commitment, and their love. 5 years had passed since that desperate night in Devil's Canyon, 5 years during which Marcus and Ayanna had traveled a path that had taken them far from the harsh landscapes of Arizona Territory to the rolling hills of Northern California, where gold fever had created communities willing to accept strangers who asked few questions and offered honest work in return for acceptance. The small cabin they had built together sat in a clearing beside a creek that reminded Ayanna of the sacred springs near her childhood home, while Marcus found in the surrounding pine forests echoes of the mountain camps where he had learned to love the wilderness during his college years. They had chosen this location carefully, seeking a place remote enough to offer safety from pursuit but accessible enough to allow them to trade with the growing settlements that were transforming California into something neither fully American nor entirely frontier. Their journey to this peaceful refuge had been neither easy nor straightforward. After escaping from Colonel Thornfield's search party that night in the canyon, they had spent weeks hiding in the most remote corners of Apache territory while planning their permanent departure from the Southwest. The decision to leave everything behind had been agonizing for both of them, but the alternative was a future of constant fear and inevitable separation. Ayanna had been forced to abandon not only her beloved grandmother but also her role as heir to generations of traditional healing knowledge. The night before their departure, she had spent hours with Winona, confessing the truth about her evening disappearances and her relationship with Marcus. The old medicine woman's reaction had been complex, combining genuine sorrow at losing her granddaughter with grudging respect for the courage required to follow such a difficult path. Rather than condemning Ayanna's choice, Winona had spent their final hours together sharing the most precious secrets of her craft, ensuring that the ancient knowledge would not be completely lost when her granddaughter entered the white world. She had also given Ayanna a bundle of rare seeds and medicinal plants, along with detailed instructions for cultivating them in different climates, recognizing that healing knowledge would be valuable wherever her granddaughter chose to make her new home. Marcus had faced equally difficult farewells, though his parting from his family had been complicated by the bitter circumstances of their final confrontation. A letter from his older brother, delivered through intermediaries months after their escape, had revealed that Colonel Thornfield had declared his youngest son dead rather than acknowledge his desertion. The official records would show that Lieutenant Marcus Thornfield had been killed during an Apache attack, dying heroically in service to his country rather than living as a disgrace to the family name. The fictional death had provided Marcus with an unexpected gift: complete freedom from his past identity. There would be no pursuit, no ongoing efforts to reclaim him for military service, because officially he no longer existed. The price of this freedom was the knowledge that he could never again contact anyone from his former life, but it also meant that he and Ayanna could build their new life without constantly looking over their shoulders for signs of pursuit. Their journey to California had taken nearly 6 months, as they traveled slowly and carefully through territory where two people of obviously different backgrounds might attract unwanted attention. They had developed an elaborate story about their identities, presenting themselves as Marcus Thompson and Anna Thompson, a young married couple from Texas who had lost their farm to drought and were seeking a fresh start in the gold fields. The deception had required both of them to master new skills and suppress natural behaviors that might reveal their true origins. Marcus had learned to present himself as a simple farmer rather than an educated soldier's son, while Ayanna had worked to modify her speech patterns and body language to appear more like a woman raised in white society. The effort had been exhausting, but their survival had depended upon their ability to convince strangers that they belonged together in the world they claimed to inhabit. California had proved more accepting of their fabricated identity than either had dared hope. The chaos and opportunity created by the gold rush had attracted people from all over the world, creating communities where personal history mattered less than current contribution. As long as Marcus and Ayanna worked hard, paid their debts, and avoided trouble with the law, their neighbors seemed content to accept them at face value. Marcus had found work as a guide and translator for mining expeditions, using his military training and outdoor skills to help greenhorn prospectors navigate the dangerous terrain of the Sierra Nevada. His knowledge of engineering and geology, acquired during his college education, had proven valuable in evaluating potential mining sites and designing efficient extraction methods. Within 2 years, he had earned enough respect and money to purchase their current homestead and begin establishing the life they had dreamed of during their secret meetings in the canyon. Ayana had initially struggled more with their new circumstances, finding herself isolated in a world where her traditional knowledge and cultural perspectives had little apparent value. But, gradually, she had begun to discover ways to adapt her healing expertise to the needs of their new community. The mining camps were full of men who suffered from injuries, illnesses, and ailments that the few available doctors were either unable or unwilling to treat. Working carefully to avoid suspicion about the source of her knowledge, Ayana had begun offering herbal remedies and traditional treatments to neighbors who couldn't afford conventional medical care. Her success rate had been remarkable, leading to a growing reputation as someone who could heal conditions that had stumped trained physicians. Word of her abilities had spread throughout the region, bringing patients from hundreds of miles away and establishing her as an integral part of the community. The combination of Marcus's business success and Ayana's medical practice had created a comfortable life that neither had imagined possible during those desperate months when they had believed their love was doomed by circumstances beyond their control. They had built not just a home but a genuine place in a community that valued their contributions and respected their privacy. More importantly, they had been able to create a synthesis of their different backgrounds that honored both their Apache and European heritages while transcending the limitations of either. Their home contained artifacts and decorations that reflected both cultures, arranged in ways that created something entirely new rather than simply mixing incompatible elements. Their daily routines incorporated traditional Apache practices alongside European customs, creating rhythms of life that felt natural and authentic despite being unlike anything either had known before. Their relationship had deepened and matured through the challenges of building their new life together. The desperate passion of their secret courtship had evolved into something more complex and enduring, a partnership based on shared values, complementary skills, and genuine understanding. They had learned to communicate not just in words but in the countless subtle ways that couples develop when their lives become truly intertwined. The isolation that had once seemed like a burden had become one of the greatest gifts of their new life. Without the constant pressure of family expectations and cultural obligations, they had been free to discover who they truly were as individuals and as a couple. The process had revealed strengths and capabilities that neither had fully recognized while living within the constraints of their birth communities. Yet their happiness had not been achieved without cost. Both carried permanent scars from the sacrifice of their original identities, and there were moments when the weight of their losses threatened to overwhelm the joy of their gains. Ayana sometimes dreamed of her grandmother's voice calling her name, while Marcus occasionally woke with memories of his brothers and the life he might have lived if circumstances had been different. They had also had to confront the reality that their choice to leave their respective peoples had consequences beyond their personal situation. Every Apache healer who departed from traditional communities represented knowledge that might be lost forever, while every potential military officer who refused to serve left a gap that would be filled by someone potentially less sympathetic to Native American concerns. These moral complexities had led them to search for ways to contribute to the larger conflicts they had fled, even from their distant refuge in California. Marcus had begun writing letters to Eastern newspapers, describing the realities of frontier life and advocating for more humane policies toward Native American peoples. While he could never sign his real name to these pieces, his insider knowledge of military thinking and his genuine understanding of Apache culture had made his contributions valuable to the growing movement for reform. Ayana had started working to document traditional healing methods in ways that could be preserved and shared with future generations, even if the original cultural context might be lost. She was collaborating with a sympathetic doctor in San Francisco to create a comprehensive guide to medicinal plants and traditional treatments, hoping that this knowledge might someday benefit both Native and white communities. As the 5th anniversary of their escape approached, Marcus and Ayana had begun discussing the possibility of starting a family, despite the complicated questions such a decision would raise about their children's identity and heritage. They had created a life together that transcended the boundaries their respective peoples had considered absolute, but they recognized that raising children would force them to confront questions about cultural transmission and belonging that they had so far been able to avoid. Standing together on the porch of their cabin as the sun set over the California hills, they reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them from that first desperate meeting in Devil's Canyon to their current peaceful existence. The path had been far more difficult than either had imagined possible, requiring sacrifices that had sometimes seemed unbearable, but it had also revealed possibilities that neither culture had taught them to envision. Their love story had become something larger than a simple romance between individuals from warring peoples. It had become a testament to the power of human connection to transcend seemingly insurmountable barriers, a demonstration that choice could triumph over circumstance, and proof that new identities could be created without completely erasing the value of old ones. The future remained uncertain, filled with challenges they could not yet imagine and questions they had not yet learned to ask. But, as they watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Marcus and Iana knew that they had already achieved something remarkable. They had created a love that belonged entirely to them, free from the hatreds and prejudices that had shaped their separate pasts, and strong enough to serve as the foundation for whatever new adventures lay ahead. In the distance, a coyote's cry echoed across the hills, a sound that reminded them both of the desert they had left behind and the wild freedom they had claimed as their birthright. The night wind carried the scent of pine and sage, the promise of rain and the whisper of ancient stories still being written in the secret places where love dares to challenge the boundaries that divide one people from another.